Hello, welcome back to the Old Testament prophets. Today we begin our adventure in the book of Daniel. So let me give an illustration here. When the Southern Confederacy surrendered to the Union in 1865, ending our Civil War, Northern troops continued to occupy the South as part of Reconstruction to help enforce Northern terms. And then a good part of Western Europe was occupied by Nazi Germany in World War II, if you could see in the black and dark gray areas of this map. And then after the war, the German capital Berlin was occupied by the Allies. That's what can happen to defeated countries, a military occupation. But in the ancient world, it didn't always work that way. When God brought the Babylonians against his own people in judgment after so many years of rebellion against God, the Babylonians walked much of their population of Judah, about 900 miles, to their own land to work for them. Now that's like walking along the highway to Memphis, Tennessee. This is what Babylon did to countries who consistently rebelled against them. It's expensive and infuriating to regularly bring their army 900 miles over to beat Judah into compliance again and again. So instead they brought them into Babylon for observation and control and put them to work in their own fields. Taking a nation out of their historic geographic place and then placing them in different areas also broke up any organized rebellion. This is why this is called the Babylonian captivity. Judah was in exile in Babylon. Now, the Babylonian captivity included 3 deportations of Jews to Babylon. The first captivity was in 605 BC of the best of their youth, but then more rebellion in Judah by King Jehoiakim, and so came the second captivity of their army and of many of their skilled workers and artisans and the royal family in 597 BC. Then even more rebellion under King Zedekiah, and so finally Babylon, in exasperation, came and took just about everyone in this third deportation in 586, and for their trouble destroyed most of Jerusalem and the temple. Daniel was taken in that first deportation. And so we begin his story. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Now, the Babylonians only took some of the temple treasures, a token amount to dedicate to their gods, especially Marduk, their main deity. The purpose was not to sack Jerusalem of all their wealth, because Babylon wants them to be loyal subjects, not totally embittered. Judah had not completely exasperated Babylon yet. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names: to Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. So this first captivity in 605 was small, including hand-selected young men, the best and smartest, intellectually hungry, with an affinity for learning a lot more, very healthy, and they looked good, young men of great promise. And Daniel was one of them, of the tribe of Judah, and was within the noble or royal family lines. He was almost certainly a teenager, perhaps 15, 16, 17, 18, around there, and was very devoted to the Lord. Now that makes his birth year around 623 to 620, around there, and 622 was the year King Josiah of Judah found the book of the law, if you remember that story, and they began an aggressive series of reforms in Judah for the Lord, including reading the book of the law to the people, recommitting themselves in front of them to the Lord, and then he, Josiah, had everyone in Jerusalem and Benjamin pledge themselves to it, that is, to the law. The people of Jerusalem did this in accordance with the covenant of God. So it's very possible that Daniel's parents, if they were not already serving the Lord, that at this time they recommitted themselves to the Lord when Daniel was born or 1 or 2 years old. King Josiah's reign continued another 13 years, so that the formative years of Daniel was during a time when Judah was following the Lord. That's what the rising line on this chart means under Josiah, a spiritual rise before that big decline. Then came the surprise and sudden visit of Nebuchadnezzar and troops to his home, Jerusalem. Treasures were taken, a show of force, Jerusalem subject to Babylon, and then the word that they were collecting many of the noble and royal young men. Now, if his parents were godly, which I propose as a pretty good chance from the Josiah revival and from how spiritually strong Daniel is, and if these parents had the opportunity for their last words with him, well, let me ask you, what would you say if you were his father or mother in those moments? Well, we'll have a discussion about this in class. I'm sure we would say something like, God will provide for you, Daniel, and enable you to live for him in that land. Keep your faith. This captivity of royal and noble young people was actually prophesied by the prophet Isaiah about 100 years prior. Now, if you remember back when we covered King Hezekiah of Judah, we noted that he foolishly gave a full tour of all of his wealth, including his military armory, to delegates from Babylon. At that time, Assyria was the overarching big enemy to both of them. It was a very unwise move, and the prophet Isaiah rebuked Hezekiah afterward. Isaiah said to Hezekiah, "Listen to the message of the Lord of heaven's armies. Look, a time is coming when everything in your palace and the things your ancestors have accumulated to this day will be carried away to Babylon. Nothing will be left, says the Lord. Some of your very own descendants, whom you father, will be taken away and will be made eunuchs or officials in the palace of the king of Babylon." So some of Hezekiah's own, I think it would be his great-grandchildren, will be in that group, in this first deportation, whether it be Daniel or some of the others. Now, the strategy of Nebuchadnezzar was a wise and long-range plan. The king of Babylon planned to be over the land of Judah and the exiles in Babylon forever. He needed royal advisors, translators, sharp people who could accurately and loyally advise him and be a go-between person with the Jews. And there was every hope to assimilate these impressionable young people, hence the 3 years of elite education. Nebuchadnezzar not only wanted their minds, but wanted their hearts. Their allegiance and loyalty, converts to the Babylonian culture and gods. Now, since the word eunuch was used in Isaiah and Daniel, were these Jewish young men made eunuchs? That is, surgery on the men so they never could have children? Well, the answer is, we don't know. The term could mean just a court official, or a court official who was physically made a eunuch. I give it a better chance he was not made a eunuch, because we know the term can mean just a court official, but also Nebuchadnezzar's purpose was to win the allegiance and the hearts of these young men. And, well, being made a eunuch just wouldn't be a good start for that. But ultimately, we don't know. Their names were also changed from Hebrew names to ones that referred to Babylonian gods. Daniel and Azariah get names that honored Nebo, their god of wisdom, writing, and of the scribes. Hananiah and Mishael had names with the moon god Aku. Outwardly, Belteshazzar was Daniel's new name, but not inwardly. When Daniel wrote his book, he went by Daniel. However, the first big test to the Jews was food. And how much do teenagers like to eat? But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. So the Babylonian foods didn't always jive with the Mosaic dietary laws. Daniel was well informed. Somebody has been teaching Daniel the scriptures. The Babylonians ate pork and horse meat, both forbidden by the law of Moses, and they also ate different seafoods, whereas the Lord said only those creatures with fins and scales. So parts of the menu were not kosher. Second, there was the wine. Now we've already talked about Babylonian wine when we were in the book of Habakkuk. The Babylonians drank a lot of it. Now, as to the alcohol level of their wine, we don't know. It could be just that to get enough water to be healthy, one had to take in too much alcohol. But we don't know that for sure. It's also possible that the meat and drink were first offered to the Babylonian gods, and that this became known to Daniel. So that's a possibility. But for sure, there was at least one problem here, being kosher with the king's food, and perhaps two with the offering to their gods. And here was Daniel, 900 miles from home, parents and religious teachers not around, just his peers, and no evidence that anyone else was concerned about the food yet. Here's the test of the real Daniel. If his parents were indeed strong believers, here was a moment they were praying about, a time when there was a clear split in the road, the Babylonian way or God's way. And with nobody looking but God, Daniel chose the way of faith, the hardest road by far in this case. Daniel understood that although God had given Judah over to Babylon, God was still with them. He still cared for them and still required obedience from them. They were not free to choose another religion or set aside God's law. And the scripture said that God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of this chief administrator. So Daniel shared something with his overseer, something like, I have a problem because in my culture I'm not allowed to eat these foods or drink this wine. And I think Daniel probably made it a Jewish matter, not a Babylonian problem, which I think contributed to the official not taking offense. All right, let's get back to the text. And we're in verse 10. But the official told Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. Daniel had a good working relationship here. They're talking freely. Daniel is like Joseph, isn't he? God gave both of them favor to their captors. Now, there's something very interesting in these verses. Up to now, the issue was with Daniel. But starting in verse 11, Daniel's 3 friends join him in the food request. And they now asked the overseer under that chief administrator, who was also favorable to the Jews. Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. So the narrative started with Daniel alone being concerned about defiling himself, and the chief steward didn't want to get in trouble because of Daniel. But then there started another conversation, perhaps another day, after Daniel had perhaps inspired these other 3 to join in league with him about the food. So when Daniel asked the overseer under the chief steward for this 10-day test, it was for 4 people, not just 1. Now, we don't have to feel sorry for these 4 young men eating plates of broccoli every day. I like broccoli. But anyway, the word for vegetables here refers to food that is grown from seeds. So it would also include fruits and grains. These are growing boys. And I shouldn't fail to highlight, God gave Daniel 3 great friends in Babylon. So much better than being all alone in his faith there. This trial might have been what drew them together. And how did the test go? At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. God was in this. He led and honored these young men. Now, you can go on the Daniel diet if you want as a biblical model for eating, but the context here more points to what God was doing through this, not necessarily showcasing a plant-based diet as superior, but actually maybe a plant-based diet is superior. I don't know. I'm not an expert on those things. It's interesting that in Daniel 10, though, verses 2 and 3, Daniel goes on a restricted diet for 3 weeks while mourning and says, I ate no pleasant food, nor meat nor wine came into my mouth. So apparently this plant-based diet was temporary, and later when he was a dignitary, he could control what kosher meat and wine he used. So to these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. So Daniel and his 3 friends absorbed all that Babylonian education with understanding and wisdom as they had that foundational fear and reverence and faith in the Lord. I'm sure they learned the Babylonian oral and written language so fluently that it was very impressive. And Daniel was gifted by God to understand and interpret visions and dreams. Another parallel with Joseph in Egypt. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. Graduation. Summa cum laude. They studied hard, but God helped them to impressively master all the material and gave them abundant wisdom. And every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. That is, until he was about 85 years old. God planted him there, gifted him. He's wise, he's protected. Now, these 4 were even better and more wise than, and we expect to read, the other Jewish men. But instead we read they were 10 times wiser than those Babylonians already in the court, which were supposed to be the wisest in the country. Wow. The way they said that then was they were 10 hands better. Not even close. Today, we say someone was hands down the best, which comes from horse racing when the winner is so far ahead that the rider can relax and drop his hands down, loosening the reins. All this Babylonian learning will include stuff that they didn't agree with, that wasn't true, but they could still learn the material and were under no compunction to correct their teachers every time they were wrong. God was setting them up for ministry opportunities. The time will come when they will speak forth truth, and it will be at a time when people were ready to listen, just like a careful missionary would do when landing in a new culture. Daniel and his 3 friends not only had a top Babylonian education, they also had the truth of God as a foundation with which to discern everything else. The fear of God is the beginning of both knowledge and wisdom, Proverbs writes. So some key words for us to ponder from Daniel chapter 1. Favor. God gave Daniel and the 3 favor with the overseer and favor with the king. Learning and skill. God granted them an impressive learning and skill with their Babylonian education. But of course they still had to study hard, but God blessed their education, and that education will open doors of spiritual influence for them. But it all began when they resolved not to sin against God. Though it seemed that the circumstances absolutely demanded that they eat the other food, they put their trust in God, and He opened a way. All this reminds us of a verse like Proverbs in chapter 3. Let not steadfast love and faithfulness forsake you. Bind them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart. So you will find favor and good success in the sight of God and man. A really interesting passage on this point is in Luke chapter 2, when Jesus was 12 years old and talking with the Jewish leaders. After 3 days, they, that is Joseph and Mary, found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. So note what Jesus did, young Jesus. First, he was listening to them. We might think they need to be listening to Jesus. But listening to them was the respectful thing to do with these older leaders, that is, humanly older. And this led to Jesus asking them questions, great questions, profound questions. And in the course of all this, Jesus was able to weave some insightful answers in the conversation, which amazed them. He didn't just come in, level their beliefs, and give the answers. That would have been offensive and would have destroyed any kind of chance for honest conversation and learning. So in this lively conversation, the Jewish religious leaders were not offended, but amazed and probably challenged. The paragraph ends, "And Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man." Which takes us back to that Proverbs passage which also captures Daniel and his 3 friends. They were faithful, and God gave them favor and success in the sight of God and others. Now, in the next chapter, there's a new challenge. King Nebuchadnezzar has a vivid dream, a vision sent from God, and I'm super excited to tell you that story next week, Lord willing. Thanks very much.